I was still on mute. Okay. Okay. Now now you can actually hear me. Thanks very much for the intro. Really appreciate it, and appreciate the time for everyone joining. Yeah, it's a super interesting topic. I don't pretend to be an expert on COVID by any means, and I don't think there is such a thing as an expert on HR or management during a period like this. I don't think this has ever happened. In fact, I know this has never happened before. But I was an HR director at a firm during the SARS crisis and through H1N1, which are probably the only similar things in our lifetimes. And I think there was some learning from that, but this seems such a new situation. And so, yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about my background and some of the topics that I've been talking to my network of senior HR folks about, and some of the topics I've been talking to our clients about. I'm going to talk a bit about the kind of tools that we use within Panalyt that are helping our clients at this time, and how I think about sort of how those tools can be used. And as you said, this is intended as a very interactive session. This isn't just about me lecturing. So do please just either put up your hand in the chat or just shout out if you want to ask a specific question. And I've kind of built in a couple of Q&A sort of stops along the way to check in and see if anyone wants to ask questions at that point. And I'm happy to be free-ranging and get off topic if anyone wants to dig into to anything specific around HR and this talent environment. Okay, so there's some preamble. Yeah, so my name is Daniel West. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Panalyt. We've been a startup for the last 2.5 years, focused on people analytics, which is really the bringing together of data from across your organization and presenting it in useful and interesting ways. Yeah, my background is almost entirely HR. I lived in Japan on and off for 15 years. I used to work for Morgan Stanley as the kind of head of back office HR systems, data processes. I was then the head of HR for Apple in Japan and Australia. And then I worked with Apple in Cupertino in the US as the head of HR for US sales and the global online store. Came back to Asia with Noble Group, if anyone remembers, the very large commodities player out of Hong Kong, where we had about 17,000 people worldwide, and I ran that operation for a while, and was then, yeah, the head of HR for Uber for about 1.5 years through the super high growth phase here in Asia. We went from a couple of hundred people to about 4,500 in the space of 18 months, which I don't recommend anyone ever does again. And then after doing some consulting for some VCs and investors, supporting other super high growth startups, me and my co-founders jumped into building this tool that we called Panalyt for people analytics. Okay, so that's kind of my HR background, and kind of I currently have a very data focus, but I don't want this to all be about data. Just thinking about the impact of COVID, what we've seen in our client organizations and what I've seen in the marketplace, it has been absolutely night and day about how it's affected working or work styles of organizations. A very large percentage of our clients are e-commerce companies, so they've had a really good time commercially, but have had a just as difficult a working environment as any other organization. Head office organizations having to work from home, having to make sure that the warehouses are properly structured to make sure that their workforce doesn't get sick, and having to put in place workforce channels to make sure that if they do have workforce getting sick, that they can support this new influx of business. But even outside but particularly outside the worlds of e-commerce, I know that organizations have been very have faced a lot of difficulties economically, and that isn't made any easier when you take into account the change in the work environment. So most organizations are just not set up to work remotely, and maybe the kind of people that are on this call would be surprised because probably the kind of people on this call are from relatively high-tech organizations that are interested in this kind of issue, and maybe have pushed their organizations to be more tech-driven and enabled their population to operate remotely. But I think you might be surprised that the vast majority of organizations that we come across and that I've done some consulting with, that are not prepared for this at all, that are not structured for allowing homework. There's still, particularly across Asia, and we have a large operation in Japan, and of course a lot of my network is in Japan. A lot of very large organizations in that market still operate massively on paper, that there's still a huge amount of paperwork and physical paperwork that is part of their day-to-day work. I know the same is true in Indonesia, in some other Southeast Asian markets, and those businesses have not been set up to make this to make remote working work. And so that's been incredibly difficult for them. And we've been talking to a really rapidly put together set of digitization project managers that have been tasked with getting their company from kind of 0 to 60 in terms of being able to operate remotely. And that's been, I would say that's a good half of the companies that we interact with. And so it's no surprise when I saw this on the CNBC CFO survey that literally just came out, that 40% of the CFOs that they've spoken to say that their business will take at least 3 to 6 months to get up and running normally. And that's on the assumption that's from when they can all start being back in the office permanently. And I think the concern that's raised there is that a lot of organizations will send people back to work. Then there will be a second phase of the COVID crisis, and then they'll have to start sending people back home. Where I think the organizations that approached the quarantining in a very smart way focused on having an incremental introduction to the quarantining. Companies that got ahead of the quarantining, and there are several in our client network, where companies that were, let's say, 1,000 to 2,000 employees had office premises that were up to, let's say, 1,000 people in one office situation. They were segmenting their office sites so that they could quarantine in a kind of periodic cycle. So they would separate their office into, let's call it 10 compartmentalized units, not allowing people to cross-communicate or cross-travel between those physical office spaces, and then allowing those office segments to quarantine, let's say 3 days a week or 4 days a week. But that was before the real quarantine restrictions were put in place in Singapore. And so some companies are using that as a learning about how they're structuring their return to work. And so that they're not going to put everyone back in these physical offices all together from the get-go. They're going to introduce a compartmentalized approach so that if there is a second phase, it doesn't hit the entire office. And I think that's a very smart approach. In terms of so the impact of COVID on organizations in quarantine isn't the only effect, obviously, but in terms of the quarantine effect, employees are increasingly suffering from a sense of isolation, that they're not able to have the same interaction with their colleagues or their social network, but also their colleagues. So isolation is really upticking as a concern for senior HR directors in my network. I surveyed about 20 odd people about what their organizations were seeing as some of the biggest concerns, and across the board, all HR directors operating in MNCs are engaging consultants who focus on issues of isolation and issues of employees feeling disconnected. Some of those are kind of some of those are structuring interventions to bring teams together online and to just counteract that sense of isolation. Some of these are structured as counseling, on-demand counseling that's being made available to employees that are feeling that isolation, identifying that, and then being given access to this resource. And I think that's a really positive thing. I think that beyond the practical effect, I think this is seen as having an effect of showing that the company is really employee focused and is focused on ensuring that employees are surviving this change in work style. And so I think the use of that sort of isolation counseling services, I think, is very progressive, and I think also it's very scalable. I think organizations of any size can make use of this. I mean, I was focused particularly on my network that are operating at very large scale multinationals, but it's something that a company of almost any size can look at making that kind of service available to its employees, even if you're keeping the budget relatively low and because your organization isn't a huge size. But it's definitely something worth considering. Change to work style. Again, companies, I'm going to talk a minute about companies that are set up well for remote work and what we can learn from that. But I think any organization should be able to look at what the change in work style is meaning to employees. A couple of the HR directors I was interviewing have initiated surveys within the organization specifically targeted at learning what is impacting your ability to do your job differently if you're working remotely. What do you think the company can do to counterbalance that? What are the tools that you need that are different? And again, I think that proactive reach out has some practical impacts and practical value, but I think it also has a very strong value of showing the employee that the organization is concerned about how they're operating, concerned about how the employee is feeling during this process. And the practical value, obviously, and this is where in some part these digitization projects that I was referring to are coming in, because they are gathering information about what has changed or what needs to change to allow employees to do their work while they're remote, and that becomes their immediate focus. So if you're talking about prioritizing, what are we practically going to do? This is the kind of thing where it resonates with employees, and of course resonates with their sense of engagement with the organization, that the organization is actively asking for them for advice about what to improve. Access to managers is a major issue, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit further on, but you have to acknowledge that employees are almost certainly getting less manager time with in this situation, and that everything that could have occurred naturally and organically in their organization now almost has to be scheduled. And so there's been a lot of talk around Zoom fatigue, and I'm not really going to get into that because I think that's been covered a lot in a lot of media I've seen. I think Zoom fatigue is a little bit of a cutesy phrase. I don't think it really matters that it's Zoom or anything else. And in theory, the number of meetings that you're in didn't need to change because of remote work. But in fact, logically it didn't need to change, but actually it has changed, because everything that could have been a occasional meeting has transferred onto Zoom and has become a more formal scheduled meeting. And so those chance interactions have lessened, and if managers aren't open to kind of expanding their number of meetings in a day and being able to focus on employees and making sure they're connecting with them, that access to manager disappears. And across all of the organizations I've worked at, whenever we've done exit interviews, one of the absolute top, consistently top concerns or issues that employees have has been access to their manager, has been access or alignment or a common view of the job with their manager. And think if that manager connection is diminishing, then obviously that's going to become more of an issue, and that will contribute to either lack of engagement or attrition. Access to coaching is very, very similar. Are people who are getting their active training on the job from their immediate boss, are they still getting that active training if they're remote? But similar issue to access to managers. But beyond the pure quarantine issue, again, HR directors in my network, what they're reporting as seeing in the engagement surveys they're running and the kind of check-ins that they're running is a tremendous fear of change. And what fear that is depends on who you're talking to, but some employees massively fear that the remote working becomes a permanent thing. other employees are fearing that there's going to be just a direct return to the old way of doing business, where actually there are aspects of remote working that they like and they want to continue. But either way, very, very few organizations are making a clear stand as to what to do next. Most organizations are focused on how to react to the economics of the situation. They're not focused on how are the employees dealing with this, and how are the employees dealing with the uncertainty of what's going to happen in 1 month or 2 months or 3 months in terms of their work style, where actually everyone really cares about that. It's a part of human life, part of human nature, that you care about what your work life is going to be beyond the immediate horizon. And then the economic uncertainty. So we've seen, obviously in our data set within Panalyt, we're seeing attrition trends and the total size of our client organizations. And there's obviously a concern about expansion. Almost all organizations, absolutely all organizations that were planning on high employee growth relating to their business plan, that has stalled dramatically, and even obviously reductions in force, or to be honest, more common is just not replacing positions at the moment. We're seeing that tremendously. The only exception being, as I say, the e-commerce companies that have had to ramp up warehouse staff particularly. And that's more of a gig economy issue. So the economic uncertainty connects to that fear of change. Also, what the economic uncertainty drives, and this is something that I'm trying to explain to sort of all of our clients that are no longer particularly focused on things like attrition metrics, is the attrition's not stalling, the attrition's not flattening out because you've suddenly gotten better at doing everything in your organization and making your employees happier. It's flattening out because people are scared of jumping and making a move, and there's nowhere to make a move to. And so that can be severely misinterpreted if you're not bearing in mind the market situation. So that was because I knew I was doing this presentation, I did that run with my senior network, and it was amazing how consistent the feedback is across that population of the sort of senior HR leadership in MNCs. Okay, happy to answer more questions about that if anyone wants to sort of shout out or raise their hand or anything. Okay, so identifying issues in the organization. So if you're going to be able to identify issues ahead of time and get ahead of issues, you have to become data focused. I know that's kind of the point of my company, Panalyt, but one of the reasons, or the main reason why I founded Panalyt in the first place, is as an HR director, I always tried to be very data focused. I worked for organizations like Apple and Uber that are very data driven companies. At Uber especially, no decision gets made without having key commercial data. You didn't make any presentation to senior management unless you had absolutely accurate real-time access to validated, driver behavior, rider behavior, number of trips per hour, number of trips, exactly, etc. You couldn't make commercial decisions without that data being available, and yet every organization is happy to make people decisions without that data being available. And I always found that very frustrating as an HR leader, which is really what led me to found Panalyt in the first place. But in this situation particularly, with people working from home for an extended period of time, all of your other bases for making decisions, which is typically the manager intuition or the manager understanding of how their team is operating, is absent. And I think every manager that I've spoken to admits that. They recognize that even if they felt they were a very good manager before, they realize that this distance from their team is massively impacting their ability to make decisions about their team members. So becoming data focused is absolutely critical if you're going to make people decisions, if you're going to understand who your high performers are, how they're responding to this situation, and how you're going to retain them. So some of the particular focus areas you'll want around becoming data focused, you want absolutely accurate attrition data. attrition is obviously slowed massively. But even if you look backwards to your organization about what drove attrition before, you've got to work out every factor about someone leaving, why they're leaving, is it regretted, is it non-regretted, what their sort of tenure was, who their manager was, where their compensation sat relative to the organization. A lot of that data gets lost very quickly after someone leaves because the organization moves on, and a lot of those metrics are no longer available, or the recency of your understanding of why that attrition happened gets lost very, very fast. So you have to have a structure set up to accurately record all of that information, because it's absolutely invaluable in situations like we have now, where you're trying to evaluate what's driving attrition in the usual circumstances, and so you can compare that to what's happening now. Understanding those drivers of attrition, also understanding those drivers of performance. So similarly to the attrition situation, if you've identified your high performers, identify everything around what you believe is driving that high performance. Every attribute of that employee, make sure that's captured in time, so that you can in the future predict that high performance. Validate your engagement data. So a lot of companies, a lot of companies run engagement surveys in-house, or you use some of the very good tools that are on the market. But all of those surveys have all of the issues that any survey has. That surveys are inherently limited because of the nature of what surveys are. It's always an opinion of how you feel, and it also has a massive recency bias effect. Why a lot of organizations, and this was true at Uber, we didn't do engagement surveys, and organizations increasingly don't do engagement surveys on that 1-year cycle or even on a 6-month cycle. They're doing much shorter check-in surveys, or using tools that are driving that check-in aspect of organizational health or employee satisfaction, and they're driving those on a much more regular basis, monthly or even bi-weekly, and so they're getting a much more accurate sense, because it's much more real time. Okay, it's a more limited set of data points, but all of the data scientists on my team would rather have a much more accurate data set with many more data points on a more limited number of fields than have a huge number of data points that really you're saying are accurate for the whole year, but are really only accurate for the last week or two before you took the survey. Or in most cases, most people believe that it's just the day of the survey itself. So you can validate that engagement data though. So even if you're on a cycle that is every 6 months and you're doing a big engagement survey, you can validate that engagement survey by looking at things like your attrition data, like your performance data, like even if you're doing clock in, clock out, or some other data sets I'll talk about later that are derived from your chat or email systems, last email of the day, first email of the day, seeing that time period and how that changes over time. That you can use all of those data points that are not subject to the subjective nature of surveys. You can use that data to validate your engagement data. So if you're actually in the position as senior management of making critical decisions about what are we going to focus on with our people, are we going to face attrition when the economic uncertainty is released, are we doing the right thing for our employees during this COVID crisis, you're running engagement surveys. There are methods to validate that data and to make sure that the engagement survey isn't getting massively skewed by factors like that recency bias, if you look at the trend data of actual employee behavior. And I'd venture to say that engagement survey data that is not backed up or in some sense correlated or validated by another data set, you shouldn't be trusting to make key employee decisions. People data should be as clean as your sales or financial data, fundamentally. And the reason I say it that way is every commercial manager and every finance manager I've worked with implicitly understands that any error made along their process flow, so for sales, so how people input data into Salesforce, how they record number of meetings and the process of negotiation, that every sales manager understands they don't need that data for that one individual sale. They need that data down the line so they can analyze the total effectiveness of their sales pipeline, right? Every finance manager understands the same thing, that at every stage of how they run the financials, they need accuracy at each point so that they can do bigger picture analysis. And people don't seem to haven't gotten into the same habit and haven't seen the necessity of doing the same for people data. So routinely, we come across data sets that we're receiving from clients where key data, for example, who someone's manager is, which massively impacts people's engagement level with the company, their performance, their effectiveness. Managers are not recorded in a lot of clients' HR data, or even if they're using a system that requires to have the manager data, when that manager changes, the previous data point is overwritten in the back end. And many of our clients who are using quite expensive systems or quite well-known systems have no knowledge that this is happening. So when they come along and want to do analysis, whether it's with us or themselves, they realize that the entire history of a very critical data point, and actually lots of data points, are completely missing because that system doesn't keep a historical record of that data point, that it gets overwritten when you enter it in. If you're serious about this, if you're serious about retention of talent in this circumstance or any circumstance, look at how accurate your data recording is around your people data. And my main point here is you've only got finite resources. So if you're focused on retaining talent and retaining and engaging your top talent, you've only got the resources available in your organization to focus on your truly at risk and your truly high performing talent. No organization I've seen has got the management and HR resources to make everyone as absolutely happy as they can possibly be. You do have to focus your resources, and you have to focus it on what actually moves the needle for your business. Okay. I'm conscious I'm not seeing anyone putting up their hand. If I can check in and see if anyone has any questions or anything that they want me to slow down on, do please shout out. Okay, well, I'll keep talking until someone shouts out. So when I talk about if you've gathered all of that people data and if you've got that all cleansed, this is kind of an illustration that we like to use that sort of drive some really interesting conversations with senior managers around why your people data is useful, how it can be a lot more useful than most organizations are currently using it. So if you look at this picture of fine young things being pretty around a conference table, an image that we don't see anymore, but if you can see the data points that we've got, so we've got 3 data points for every individual in the room. And if you look at the kind of data points you've got, they're not the data points that you'll typically find if you're just looking into one system or one Excel sheet. So if we take the Clive at the top, the guy that's labeled 80% likely to leave, so the tall guy at the very top of the screen, you'll see the 3 data points that we've got for him. So he's 20% below the compensation range. So you're going to get that from your comp data or your payroll data. He has a 50-minute commute. So we're able to calculate that commute because obviously we've got everyone's home address, we've got everyone's office address, and you can plug that into a really easy Google Maps API, and it'll return you a commuting time. You have to make a decision whether you're assuming that he cycles or rides or takes the subway, but typically taking the subway is at least depends on the city. But for somewhere like Singapore, taking the MRT is a pretty safe bet. But anyway, so you're pulling out his commute time. You're not going to find that in any existing HR system. You can obviously generate it yourselves, but it's not something that's currently integrated with your comp data. And he hasn't had a promotion in 2 years. Now that will be somewhere in your HR system, but it's not going to appear on any easy accessible report. But if you can pull those 3 things together, just those 3 points alone will give you a likelihood of someone leaving if you've pulled those data points for everyone in your organization and all the people who left. So just by, and this is kind of like a big data analysis, but just a very, very simple example of big data analysis. You pull together those data sets, you can find the correlations, and you can come up with an estimate of people being likely to leave. So let's look at James, the guy sitting on the desk just below Clive. So so the recommendation here is that he needs a target salary increase at the next round. And sort of why, what comes out of that? Well, there's a positive data point that he has a year-on-year increasing performance score, and your performance system will have that data. He has a high organizational network score, which is a data point I'll get to in a minute, but it's simply about how connected he is to other people in the organization, how many relationships he has internally, as you can see in Slack or email or chat data. But his salary is in the bottom 10% of the team. So just that one negative point is increasing, is massively increasing this individual's likelihood of leaving. And so you can come up with an action item very logically just based on that correlation. If you go through each of these examples, you'll see that there's 3 data points, you'll see how they balance, and you'll see that none of them are rocket science. Also, none of them are engagement scores. None of these are subjective judgments by the manager. None of them are subjective judgments based on an engagement survey. None of this is interview based. You can add that data in, and that gives you another sense of confidence in your decision. But the two things should be at least aligned and correlated: the subjective data, the manager's opinion, versus these kind of data points. Because we'll guarantee that over time and over a large set of employees, these are the data points that will drive these behaviors or drive these outcomes. We'll guarantee it. But of course, on an individual by individual basis, you have to have subjective judgment as well, and the judgment of the manager doesn't get thrown out the window. So if you're thinking about the COVID situation, where the use or the effectiveness of that manager opinion on an employee who he hasn't seen for 3 months, these kind of data points become much, much more valuable. And our experience with clients is that most clients think, or most companies believe, that they don't have this kind of data available, whereas actually almost every organization does have this data available, even organizations that don't focus on it. It's just not brought together, and it may not be clean, but it's always available. Okay, I realize I'm doing a lot of talking. Does anyone want to chime in? Anyone have any questions at this point? Does anyone see the value in this kind of analysis when you're in this position of COVID? Hi, thanks, Cheryl. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's exactly. It's quant and qual. I never want to be accused of not having heart for individual employees. Everything I've ever done as an HR director is to support individuals and help them do the best job and enjoy their job. But I have to do it at scale, otherwise you can't get anything done. In my experience, who in the org does the preliminary analysis here? So if you're not using someone like us, if you're not using a third party, this is, this, at least in my experience, has always been a cooperation between someone in HR that really understands where all the data is. So that typically is your HR systems manager, or whoever your administrator is of employees come in, all their data gets into the systems. Stuff happens to them while they're an employee, they get paid and they get promoted, and then they leave and something happens to their data then. Someone knows all those connections. That used to be me when back in Morgan Stanley when I was 20 years younger. Yeah, and so there's that person that knows where all the data is. There's typically someone with my background as a business partner who kind of understands what question we're trying to answer, an HR question that's going to support the business. And there's typically a BI professional and someone that really understands how to do data analysis, how to pull multiple data sets together, how to integrate that data so that it is useful, and integrate that data so that you can put it into something like Tableau or Power BI. And so when I was doing consulting, I did consulting with a massive e-commerce venture in the Middle East. I did some consulting with a range of super high growth startups in Silicon Valley. And while I was doing that consulting, I was the one with the idea of kind of what we're trying to achieve. I also kind of knew where all the data points was because of my background, and Yusuf, my colleague who's on the line, kind of worked with me, and he's the one with the data analysis background and could actually write the code, write the scripts to bring that data all together. And that's really where we built the MVP for Panalyt out of that experience. But if you don't have those three experiences, this stuff's very, very difficult to achieve. And my frustration through my career as an HR generalist was that I knew two parts of that and I didn't know the third part around how to do the analysis. And the frustration of, again, HR folks in my network, even at very large organizations, is that they don't get given access to the BI professionals, to the data scientists, because in most organizations, I'm going to venture and say almost every organization, data scientists are such a valuable resource that they're used for the front end of the business, not the back end of the business like HR. But yeah, Veronica, does that answer your question, that you need those mix of skill sets? Hopefully that helps. Cool. Happy to help. Any other question while I'm paused? No? Okay. This is an example of our system. I'm not trying to sell this particularly, but this is the kind of analysis that you can get out of all of that data set. Again, you can build this yourselves in Tableau to some extent. We would have a debate about that, but obviously it's possible to do a one-time analysis like this. So what we're trying to show here is that there's an attrition history and there's an attrition prediction, and your prediction is built out of your attrition history. That's why there's two parts to the line. And then we can drill down to individual employees to drive an attrition risk score from very low to very high. We're at about an 85% degree accuracy over the next 6 months. So we can say over the next 6 months, based on these kind of data points, the kind of data points I was just talking about in that picture, how many managers they've had, where their compensation is against market, where their compensation is against individual level, age, tenure, gender, those very common data points that everyone should have. We can look at that from all of your past employees, and of course look across all of our client base to develop the model, and then apply that model, and then you'll get the individual scores. And yeah, at some level of accuracy, you're able to do this yourselves, and it's incredibly powerful. And what's important is, again, at this point in the COVID crisis of having people having worked from home for an extended period, there's again, you've lost that connection between the manager and the employee, if it ever existed, but you've lost what personal connection there was. And so you have to start looking at the data in order to plan out the business going forward, and to make decisions about where to focus your resources. So this becomes a very important tool. Okay, so once you've identified your at-risk people, you need to develop some retention strategies. So common retention strategies, all the HR folks in the room know the list. Compensation, how much you're paying people. And if I can pause there for a moment, if you're thinking about compensation, and let's go and do a market benchmark, all of the analysis that we've done, the analysis that I've seen at Uber before, the analysis that we've done within Panalyt, there's a really clear correlation between what you pay and the market, the external market, when it comes to hiring people. There is an absolute correlation there. Hiring people below market, you've got to have something else on offer that is tangible. And hiring against market has your compensation level against market has a massive correlation with your ability to hire and your first, let's say, 3 to 6 month attrition. It has almost no correlation. It has almost no correlation to attrition after those first 6 months. So almost no one goes to the market and tests their market value against the market on a regular basis. Only if you're super unhappy are you doing that. Or in some very specific industries like commodity trading. Commodity traders are always testing their value, but the vast majority of employees are not doing that. However, the correlation of salary against internal average for their peer group, there is a tremendously strong correlation. And so salary against your colleagues has a massive effect on retention, which leads you to the fact that every retention activity has a knock-on effect on the rest of your organization. Compensation being the strongest one, but there are others. But compensation, if you're addressing someone who seems to have a high risk of departure because their compensation is below the average of their organization, and they're aware of that, if you target that individual for a pay increase, you have a very high risk of negatively influencing the retention of their immediate colleagues who will know about that. And even their manager, who is wondering why they're not getting a pay increase. Acting on these issues, on the issues that's raised by this kind of data analysis, needs to be very careful and needs to be taken in consideration of what the knock-on effect could be. Sorry, someone else was asking a question, which is great. How can smaller organizations without large workforce analytics come up with such analysis? Yeah, absolutely. So we've applied this model both to relatively small organizations. I'm going to say at least 100 people. Doing it below 100 starts to get there's too much noise in making real decisions based on this data. So the larger the organization gets and the longer the history, the more you can actually rely on the data for decision making. But even if you were like 10 people becoming 50 people, you want to track this data because it does become very indicative. Yeah, it's an important thing to get started early. Just the same as the way you want to track your sales pipeline really early, because you want to be telling investors, you know, our sales conversion rates are getting better over time, right? So you try to get clean sales data from the very start of your startup. You want to try and do the same thing with people data as far as possible. But you're asking sort of how else can you do this without the formal analytics support? Yeah, if data is any part of your organization, and there aren't that many startups that don't have some level of data aspect, yeah, I mean, whoever's doing your financial forecasting or whoever's doing your customer behavior analysis, if you trust them, you can work with them to do some of this analysis. But you know, also you can drop me a line. I'm happy to give some advice. But yeah, generally smaller organizations struggle because it's harder to have that focus on this data set when it's not absolutely critical to your business. But yeah, just like you can analyze financial data, you can analyze people data. I hope that helps. Okay, cool. But yeah, happy to help offline if that also helps. All right, so compensation benefits is obviously important. There's been a massive uptick in people at large MNCs contacting their benefits departments, as you might imagine. Even if people aren't sick with COVID or they don't have a relative who's sick, they want to know what their coverage is and they want to know how to address it. And most organizations haven't been particularly well set up to communicate their benefits. I have spent time as a benefits consultant myself. And every time a client ever asked us, I've got $1 per employee, I can spend more on benefits, where should I spend it? And they're thinking, do I put it in pension? Do I put it in healthcare? And the overwhelming answer, if you've just got $1 per employee, it absolutely needs to be in communication. Get yourself set up so that your benefits are well communicated to employees, so they don't need to scrabble around and waste a huge amount of your what should be working time working out what their benefits are. So benefit communication, yeah, the information being easily available is absolutely worth the investment, especially when this kind of stuff happens. Training is a real retention strategy, making sure people have got access to training. Again, what we've seen in this period is our kind of peer group of HR tech, the companies that have focused on remote learning have done very well. There's been a lot of companies going to remote training apps, particularly where people can do kind of just-in-time training, just-in-time skills development. That's been a really big investment area for larger MNCs and larger organizations. And again, it's something that's very scalable. So these tools typically operate on a sort of a cost per user basis, where there is obviously discount the larger your company is, but even for a very small organization, it shouldn't be that expensive to get your employees signed up for online training or online skill development tools. Work hours is a very common retention strategy in the macro. When you're looking at organizations that I've worked for have very easily found in their data a very high drop-off rate in female workers who are in their early 30s, who've been with the organization for 2 to 3 years. You are able to retain those folks if you're able to show that that work hour flexibility is there, that that there's an acknowledgement that people's work hours change as they go from their 20s into their 30s and 40s. And now with COVID driving remote working practices, I see this as a huge potential advantage to organizations, because now, having learned how to allow employees to work from home, you can now restructure some of your work practices to allow greater flexibility to employees that need it, and that will drive much greater retention in your organization generally over time. Culture and inclusion is a very important thing. I've talked a little bit about that with staying focused on what individuals' needs are from a personal perspective, and understanding how COVID's impacting people. But yeah, getting people connected back to your culture is obviously a very common retention strategy, and professional development opportunities. And so how do you think about these factors during remote work, particularly when it comes to that professional development opportunity? I've worked with a number of organizations that have been remote working from the beginning, and looking at what's common about those organizations that have made remote working work. An overwhelming aspect has been that they're set up for remote work from the beginning. And so when all other organizations are asking me sort of, what factors can we learn from those organizations to just plug into our own organization, it doesn't work, because they're set up from scratch to remote work. And so therefore every aspect of their technology setup, to how they hire people, how they pay people, and how they retain people, is all structured as a single unit. But these are the key attributes, and you can see what you can plug and play into your organization. So typically organizations that are built to support remote work, they have a very strong focus on hiring experienced, mature people from the beginning. There's very little crossover between remote working organizations and people that are doing active professional development of junior employees. And that's really why I was skipping from the previous page. Let me ping back. Professional development opportunities, that is commonly a retention strategy in normal circumstances. Oh, I've gone too far back. It aligns directly to this situation, because that's a very difficult thing to manage while you are remote working. Professional development opportunities typically come out of interacting with your senior leadership, people recognizing your capabilities or recognizing your weak areas, and giving you stretch projects or access to the senior leadership, or getting them into meetings or projects that will develop them for their next role. And that's something that's typically a very hands-on approach with most organizations. It's very difficult to do in remote working, and there's other factors too around sort of individual maturity, individual levels of responsibility, working style. But typically that's an attribute of remote working organizations that you see, that they don't hire junior staff. They typically have very strict OKR and KPI management processes and systems. They have a very clear physical meeting schedule and budget and support for those. So organizations I've seen will have senior leadership will meet every 3 months. Sort of division heads will meet with their direct support sort of every 6 months. The whole organization will meet once a year, and anyone that's kind of in the same city as another colleague will get together every week or every 2 weeks if they work together. And senior leadership routinely travel around the kind of key groupings, the larger groupings, and hold get-togethers. And that there's a specific budget line put aside to support this. Just because you're not paying for offices doesn't mean that there's no cost of building a fully remote organization. And maybe there is something there to learn about that physical meeting schedule that we can learn through through COVID. Not that we're going to do physical meetings, but that you are going to schedule get-togethers to focus on culture and communication issues. Professional development tools. Again, this is actually really relating to what I was saying before about the remote working. The training tools that are kind of on demand, that are app-based, that are allow employees to choose their training and choose their timing of training. That gets out of this idea of classroom-based training and into more modern ideas of what's called sort of continuous learning or kind of pathway-driven learning. And access to leadership. So again, the remote working organizations I consulted with had a really clear metric on the senior leadership team about, you know, they were going to talk to everyone in their organization. The largest one I consulted with was about 1,500 people, and they had about 6-7 people in senior leadership team. But they were going to say that over a 6-month period, every single person in the organization would have had FaceTime with that senior leadership team, that they were not going to let anyone at any level of the organization feel like they couldn't just call up or text a senior leader, that they would have had some FaceTime that would give them the confidence to have that direct interaction. Does anyone?
There's a question there. There's a question there. So what I'm thinking of doing is, you know, in case they have counter questions or follow-ups, I'll just unmute the participant.
Oh yeah, sorry, I just saw the question. Am I seeing any companies rewriting any of their policies, doing quick fix workarounds? That's a super good question. So I'm getting a lot of companies either asking me for advice or my peer group that are kind of putting it to the group around just that issue. And it also relates to a very early point I made about employees being uncertain about the future, because most organizations haven't made a clear decision about how they are coming back from COVID and how quick that's going to be, and are they going to allow remote work or not, and is it going to be restricted to some people or not, and because they haven't made those strategic decisions. And I think everyone's encouraging leadership to make some of those decisions as soon as they can, because I think the uncertainty is hurting their organizations. So they're not particularly rewriting long-term policies because they haven't made that decision. Although I'd counsel them they are. I think most organizations are doing quick fix workarounds to put support in place. I think there's one validity to that if they're really doing some quick fixes and viewing it as almost an A/B test to work out which of these work for us and which ones don't. I think that's a fair approach. But I think actually almost too many organizations are quickly putting things in place and without the structures to support those initiatives, and without gathering the data about their effectiveness. But what percentage of companies will consider this their highest priority? I don't know. And also you mentioned values. I don't believe I've heard of any organization talking about revisiting their values. I think that would be really interesting if there was a company that was thinking that their work structure, how they do their working environment, affected their values that deeply. That would be really interesting. But no, but I do think a lot of large organizations are talking about, are they going to long-term change policies to either allow structure their organizations so that remote working is more possible, and how they're going to allow that. Yeah, but it's absolutely the right question, and there isn't an easy answer, but there definitely is no trend that I've identified. I haven't seen any organization. I haven't seen any trend of any organization making long-term decisions to address this situation. Culture plays a huge part in driving the vision of an organization. Given the current situation, what are thoughts on losing track of organizational culture? Yeah, I think this massively impacts organizational culture. But I think how companies respond will say whether their culture gets fundamentally negatively or positively pushed by this. And I think there's lots of opportunities for positively driving organizational culture, especially if it drives leadership and managers to think about this last point that I'm making on this slide about that access to leadership. If organizations stop taking for granted that just because they're physically in the same office that people are getting good amounts of manager time and good amounts of leadership time, I think a lot of analysis shows that employees don't feel they get that time, but maybe remote working and this crisis is going to make leaders sort of be more structured about how they make sure they've got leadership time. Suggestions for HR to keep the momentum going. The suggestions for HR, I think, is kind of built into these last couple of slides. It's about, you know, what is going to impact our organization, what are the key decisions we need to make about going forward, and what are going to be the impacts of those. And also, I'd like to think that being more structured around gathering data so that we can make better on-the-fly decisions around our people is going to be part of that. But I think a large part of it is this slide about how much of the remote organization structure practices are we going to adopt to make sure that we can continue growing if this happens again, or if we want to give this opportunity to more employees to work from home because it works for them. Wow, loads of questions coming in. I'm going to focus on questions. Okay. Am I observing compensation plans being revisited? No. I asked that question as well. No one at any of the MNCs I was talking to has had any focus on compensation. They don't believe it's a necessary factor. I suppose that's largely driven because none of them have made real decisions about changing their work style long term. No, I haven't seen any trend in changing compensation strategy. I don't know if that helps you, but yeah. Should achieving employee return to a company that laid him off outside COVID-19 without database? You mean, K1, are you saying should a high performing employee return to a company that laid him or her off in case they resumed work? Are you saying that if a company laid someone off and they want to come back, and the company wants them back, should the employee do that? I think that's is that the question? I think that's the question. So
yeah. Even you could unmute yourself if the question's not okay. It seems to be the question.
Yeah, it seems like I got it. You know, that's such an interesting question. I think it's such a personal question. I think I talk a lot about data and making a data-driven decision, but for an individual employee, if they were let go by a company because of what they saw as the economic situation, and now the economic situation has changed, and they want that employee to come back, I think if that was done positively, if that was done with the correct level of respect and mutual communication and honesty on behalf of the leader with that employee, and that employee understood why they were being let go, and they understood that was the economic reality, and then that company wants them back and they do that in a positive and engaging way, yeah, absolutely, I think they should go back. You know, everything else about the job was what they wanted. So I just think it's about respect and about honesty and openness. But you know, you learn about an organization, you learn a lot about an organization and a leader when things are under pressure, and particularly, you know, when people exit. But it was you know, it was always a very what's the word? It's a measure of the honesty with which you deal with your team members. That when people leave, they feel positively about the organization. It's a very hard thing for a lot of organizations to achieve, but I've always found that with respect and honesty, that typically produces a good outcome. I don't think the company should have any concern about going back to good performing employees and saying, hey, economic situation's changed, please come back. I think that's something that you should do if you've dealt with people honestly. Are there any trends I've observed in the short-term and long-term incentive plans? No, I haven't seen any trends in, as I was saying before, about compensation. I know you're talking about incentive plans. I'm just going to get to incentive plans a little bit in a minute, but I think there's a huge amount of concern in the employee base across all the organizations that the performance reviews and therefore promotion considerations and therefore compensation, performance bonuses and pay raises, etc. All of that process, what we call the kind of the HR calendar, is all, almost every organization is driven off lots and lots of personal meetings, one-on-one meetings with your boss or with HR, and with HR getting together with senior management. All of that HR calendar stuff is all driven, again, through a certain way of working. And so I see a lot of concern, or at least I hear from the network, that their employees are very often raising the issue of how is my bonus going to be decided, or how is my performance going to be assessed, and therefore how is my bonus going to be decided when I haven't seen my manager for 3 months and he's never available to talk to me on Zoom. So I think there's a lot of concern about the process, but no one's talking about a change in actual policies or metrics that I've heard. Okay, so once the new normal becomes regular practice, what will be the impact of various factors on the retention mentioned earlier? Yeah, I think I can talk about that a little bit further as I go on. I'll talk about sort of the impact on some retention factors. So let me get to that in a minute. How much probability a foreign employee could get employed before versus Stephen, are you in Singapore? Is that a Singapore related question? Oh, Indonesia. So you're talking about foreigners being employed in Indonesia, or foreigners being employed in somewhere else? Vice versa. Yeah, I think I understand what you mean. If I think about, I think Singapore is a particular situation. Anyone who's here has probably observed that every time there's an election, the difficulty of getting EPs crunches. And over the last, I want to say 2-3 years, probably longer than that, 3-4 years, the ability to get EPs, especially for less qualified individuals, has become tighter and tighter and tighter. Everything I'm hearing from my couple of contacts on the MOM side is EPs are going to be incredibly hard to get over the rest of this year. Partly it's election driven, but largely it's that there's going to be an economic crunch, and a lot of people lost their jobs, and they want to make sure Singaporeans get jobs first. I have no official word on this, but everything that I'm hearing says that EPs are going to get super, super hard for Singapore. I can't really speak to any other market. I'm not that in touch with, I mean, everyone's seen what Donald Trump's done in the US about massively limiting visas there, and again, driven by the same kind of election economic crunch aspect. I'd be very interested if anyone who's in an HR role wants to chime in on the chat about their understanding of how their country is going to approach issuing work visas to foreigners after the crisis. But learning from recent history and the 2008 crisis, yeah, I think it's going to get really, really hurt. Okay, I'm going to jump on. Okay, oh, the HR calendar. I literally just was talking about this. Okay, so I think I've kind of covered this point already. I understand that employee, or at least HR leaders, are hearing from employees that they are feeling a huge uncertainty about what we typically refer to as the HR calendar, the really routine stuff that happens every year, the performance management and evaluation. If you have not thought about how you're going to do this, and how you're evaluating your employees, when again, managers haven't had a lot of contact, when it's going to be harder to do those one-on-one meetings, or even if you're going back to work, you can now do the one-on-one meetings, but they did just have an extended period of not being in close communication. Obviously, for the non-HR folks, the performance management and evaluation process, whether it's like every month or just once a year, that massively drives how you do talent planning, which is related to headcount planning, how you're planning how people are going to get what talent you need in the business over the next year, and how you're going to source that. Is it coming internally, externally? Do I add people, subtract people? Do I have the talent to drive the business? And because out of talent planning comes promotions and assignments, and also related to performance management and headcount planning and budgeting is pay adjustments. What budget do we have? Are we going to be market driven? Are we paying above market? Who are we evaluating ourselves against? and bonuses. And bonuses typically come out of the performance process. If I can take a very quick sidebar on a personal hobby horse I have that is driven by data, is that if anyone on the line still believes in cash bonuses for the not commissions are completely different, but giving your high performers a big chunk of cash at the end of the year, or giving your low performers no cash or a little bit of cash at the end of the year, I strongly recommend you look at the data around how this actively drives performance and employee engagement, because every data point I've ever seen at any organization says that cash bonuses have almost zero impact on retention, positive impact on retention and engagement. And in fact, in most organizations, they have a slightly or moderately negative impact on attrition and engagement, because most people are just unhappy they didn't get as much as the person next to them who got more than them. Most people get less bonus than they were expecting to get. I think everyone acknowledges that there's a drop-off point where bonuses go beyond a certain mark, people can't get happier, but there's something deeper than that around people fundamentally don't trust performance appraisal processes. They think appraisal processes and bonus processes are biased, and again, they never get the amount that they want. So I recommend you reconsider cash bonuses. And professional opportunities. So and to go back to an earlier point, people aren't getting face time with their managers. They don't know how they're going to get considered for the next stretch assignment. They probably got feedback last year that if you want to get a certain job, you're going to need to show us that you can perform this skill or that attribute, change this part of how you deal with your subordinates, or show me that you've got this level of project management, and then we'll consider you for promotion. And a lot of those plans have been put in doubt because people have got less access to their manager. Therefore, they don't believe that they're going to get properly considered for ongoing professional opportunities. So again, I'd recommend to every organization to think really clearly about how they're addressing these HR calendar activities and what you're communicating to your employees now about how those things are going to be done, because it's adding to the sense of uncertainty, and uncertainty tends to drive lower performance, lower engagement. That's just logical. Access to management and leadership. I think I've spent enough time on this. People want to have that access to management and leadership. But I think if there's one overriding point through all of this, that's the one I'd say. If you were going to change one thing because of this, because of my presentation, if you're going to change one thing about how your team's operating under COVID, is have a look at are your team members, all your team members, getting enough face time with leaders and their managers. Okay, I won't pause unless you want me to pause here.
Hey Daniel, I have a question actually.
Yeah.
I'm from a product background, so not from an HR background, but I'm a people manager. I'm trying to understand, with the workforce, with everyone working remotely, are there new data points that can come into play? For example, how do I turn on my camera during meetings, or how engaged am I during, remote conversations and so on? Are there some of this data that organizations can start to, maybe consider and track potentially to form some patterns?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that's actually definitely the rest of my presentation pretty much, although I realize there's only really 10 minutes left, but I'll steam through and I'll try and give you an overview of that point. But yeah, there's a whole data set that we're focused on that is a new data set to most people. I'd say the one that I don't mention in a minute, which I bet is very interesting, although I haven't been able to look at that data set yet, is the companies that are using Zoom. There is an API out of Zoom which shows you talking time. And I think that would be fascinating to get for internal meetings. If you could look, there's 10 people on this internal meeting. They've had this meeting every day for the last 3 months. And this person has spoken 90% of the time, and this person has never spoken. I think that would be tremendously interesting. The trouble is, it's a very short period of time. 3 months is not really a long enough period of time to draw really conclusive insights from, but you got to start somewhere, and it will tell you something. But typically, most of the behaviors that we look at in big data analysis is change, that the actual value doesn't matter. It's how that value changes over time. And so like one of the key data learnings, one of the key learnings about data that I had working at Uber was we did the analysis on communication data, which I'm about to get into, but how people communicated with their colleagues. And we looked at their network data in Slack, so how many people they spoke to. And some people talk a lot, have a lot of people that they're friendly with, and some people don't talk very much. But what happens is that after joining a company, that kind of levels out and it's consistent over months and months and months and months and months. People develop a network, and that network, people may add and lose, but that network generally stays about the same size. And then you suddenly notice that whether they've got a big or small network, the number of people they speak to suddenly contracts, like over the course of a couple of weeks, and carries on contracting for about 3 or 4 months, and then they leave. And it's like a 99% indicator. And then we interviewed about 100 of these people, and they almost all reported that they recognized that was happening, that they were being rejected by their company culturally, or that they were rejecting it because they didn't, like the culture. And they observed it happening 3 to 4 weeks before they left. The data showed it happening 3 to 4 months before they left. So this is just their behavior on Slack. And okay, Uber was one of those companies that lived on Slack. But it was incredibly correlated. It didn't tell you why, it didn't tell you how to stop it, but it absolutely told you who to focus on. And it was remarkably correlated. And so I'm willing to bet that Zoom behavior, I bet, is the same too. I bet that you could work out who talks a lot on a Zoom and who doesn't talk very much. But if it changed, it would have a strong it would be strongly indicative of something. Is that interesting? Helpful?
Thank you.
Let me jump on. Yeah, someone was just saying it's so interesting. We don't realize what's happening emotionally until later. Yeah, I absolutely agree. We observe a lot of behavior, but you don't really know why it's happening. And that's why I'm never going to be the advocate of saying you can use data, you don't need HR people. I think the data is just there to make the HR folks more effective and have more tools at their disposal to focus on the right people. But I'm going to literally spend 5 minutes kind of zooming through this. So I'm going to move super fast. But I know this is being recorded, so if you're interested, you can watch or you can talk to me later. But there's an idea about who's the most influential person in the company. And the answer is, everyone always answers, it's someone in the people that they speak to. And it's always incredibly limited. And from the CEO all the way down, ask anyone who's most influential, and they're going to name 2 or 3 people that's in their direct network. And their direct network is obviously limited. Everyone's field of vision is very small. And it's so obviously true, and yet no one really spends any time thinking about this. So you can see cross-team relationships will converge on some people. You typically, at multi-level organizations, you'll have people having networks within the organization at the same level. So at Apple, I was a director. I was actually the youngest director ever hired at that time, not to blow my own trumpet. But I knew almost every other director in the business. And I was in Japan, but I knew the other sort of HR director level folks all over the world, because we were connected through a more informal network about what we were focused on the level that we were at. And so you have a certain power and influence across an organization that's level-based rather than departmental or location-based. And so if you look at person A on the left there, you can see how connected that person is. And the CEO at the center is like, okay, so person A quit, big deal. Who's that person? I don't give a damn. But other people across the organization understand that that's a real issue, that person's critically connected. And then if you see on the right, that team, once that person's left, you've now got these hub and spoke organizations that are no longer cross-connected because a critical connector lower down in the organization has left. And for very large organizations, this is very hard to see a real effect. For very small organizations, you don't really see an effect, but every organization in between, this kind of thing absolutely kills progress and growth. And managers on the ground see it, and senior leaders just don't see it. And so this connects to identifying high performers. You can do an illustration. You can do an analysis of how top performers are connected. If you're looking at chat or email data, you can look at how they're connected within an organization. You can compare your high performers network and profile with other employees to identify what is different and unique about those high performers that's driving that network behavior. But typically the anecdotal evidence on salespeople, for example, high-performing salespeople are typically better connected to marketing and operations, or whatever your execution layer is, than other salespeople. So when that salespeople who's well connected, even if he's just exchanging cat photos with someone in marketing or someone in operations every day, he's got an established relationship. And so when he needs something to happen for his client to make a big deal happen, he'll get that exception made much more quickly without having to escalate. He can get marketing and operations on side because they're really friendly with their cat photos. And it sounds too simplistic, but honestly, this is how organizations work. And also you can then scroll that back and you can see what the network behavior was of those successful salespeople when they first joined. And you can compare that to your new first joiners to identify who is establishing connections at the right pace. And if they're not networked quickly in the way that your successful salespeople are, you can nudge them and make the introductions to help them get more networked. So that's a very practical application. So this is how this kind of data looks in reality. I know it looks like a big mess, but that's the point of systems. It helps you make sense of this. But even here, you can see there's one big conglomerate of communication and network, which actually has relatively tenuous connections to a chunk of other pieces in the network. And if you really focus in, you'll start seeing some clusters where there are people around the center who have almost no connection to anyone else in the business. And so you can see there are some super connectors and some people who are very, very isolated. And this is a real company. This is really one of our clients. There are some good models. So you could pull this data out of your Slack tool yourself and sort of like throw it into something that'll produce this illustration for you. You can do it on a one-time basis. We do it continuously. We do it daily, so we can do it over time. But you could do this as a one-time analysis. And if you've got a hub and spoke, if you've got a hub and spoke with a central hub, or you've got a distributed network, this helps you to understand your organizational behaviors and your level of risk. Obviously, hub and spoke with a central hub is the highest risk structure. This is an illustration of how we use our tool. You can see that we simplify the network behavior. And if you can see on the right, we allow you to layer in filtering information so that you can say, let me just look at the marketing team, let me just look at the high performers, let me just look at people who are high risk or low risk of attrition. So you can evaluate your risk. And the reason I show this isn't just to sell our product, it's more about encouraging you to think about the collected data altogether. If you've got this, what's called ONA data, organization network analysis data, and you've got your performance data, just put the two sets together and it's genuinely powerful. This is another view of the same data, but now in a more traditional format that allows more people that like to see charts. You can see it in this way as well. So ONA, this network data, it kind of tells you where to take action, right? It identifies the people that are at the highest risk that will have the biggest impact on your company if they go. And your engagement and your attrition data tells you what to do about that. Right? I think someone else was saying this before. We don't realize what's happening with people until later, right? The ONA gives you sort of an alarm call as to what's going to happen with those people. And your historical attrition will help you to stack rank what is the most likely thing that is driving their loss of engagement. Okay, I just want to going to wrap up in just 1 minute. I just want to point out, anyone who's using WhatsApp a lot in their business, really think about the impact on your organization if it's really relying on something like WhatsApp, a non-company communication tool. It's very strongly linked with spear phishing. Obviously, you might be exposing client data, but from our point of view, you're going to completely miss this kind of network analysis data. And in any way, you ideally shouldn't be doing business on WhatsApp. But just throwing that out there. You don't need to say this in Europe and the US. but in Asia, we still use this kind of form a lot. That was all I was going to focus on. So sorry that last chunk was a little bit rushed, but you know, happy to dig into that deeper if anyone wants to.
Are there any more questions on the call? Okay.
Anyone cool? Is anyone still on the call?
They're still on the call. Some of them actually messaged me that they had to drop off. So it's this is a more fairly senior panel compared to some of the other sessions that we do. So hey, everybody, thanks for joining in. Thanks, Daniel, for sharing. I would request if some of you can still stay online for a minute. This is something we do since it's not a physical webinar. We ask people to open their cameras and we take a photo of the attendees. So if some of you are still here, it would be great if some of you can do that.
Shall I stop sharing? Might be better.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I'm just trying to find out how did I do that the last time. Ah, yeah, here's a grid view. Got it. So we've got we've got some folks with the camera on. We've got another, great. Okay, and we've got some photos. All right, waiting for some of you. All right, taking a photo here, and then yep. Thank you, everybody. A recording will be sent to you. And thanks, Daniel, for taking out the time and having a chat with us. And yeah,
cool. Hope that was valuable, and happy to talk one-on-one if anyone wants to reach out. You can. My email's on the deck on the video. Thanks very much, folks. Much appreciate it. Thanks very much for arranging. It's been really, really fun.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Lavia. Thanks, Cheryl. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Ganesh. Thanks, Nikita. Thanks, Hugo. All right, Daniel, I think we can log off. Thank you. Bye.